Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Jeff Show. This show is available on Apple, Google, Edify, Spotify, Overdrive, Liftable, and wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Jeff. Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. On this show, I interview major thought leaders who demonstrate that worldview changes everything. Our guest today is Erick Erickson. You have seen him on Fox News and on CNN. He has a daily radio show called the Erick Erickson Show. This guy's been all over the world. He grew up in Louisiana and in Dubai and has got a lot of really common sense things to say about the issues that you and I are facing right now. Erick Erickson, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Atlantic Magazine said that you are one of the most influential conservatives in America. You have had time, you're a radio talk show host. You actually filled in for the late Rush Limbaugh, and I bet there's some great stories that came through that. The Hollywood Reporter said you're the most influential conservative blogger. And so you've got a lot of insight into what is happening in this particular political moment. And you're going to share some of that, I know, as we dig into the conversation here. And I think it's going to be surprising as we go through the conversation. But before we do all of that, I would love to just hear a little bit of your story. You grew up in two places that are, as far as I can tell, as unlike as any two places in the world. You grew up in Louisiana and you grew up in Dubai. How did that shape your worldview?
To put it in proper context, when I was 5 years old, my dad worked for Conoco Oil Company, and he worked on platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. He would be gone for 7 days and come home for 7 days. And in 1980, they told him, pick a country. You got to move there. The Canary Islands, Indonesia, or Dubai. He picked the Canary Islands. They said, pick again. So he picked Dubai, and that's where we went. We were there for 10 years. So when I was 5 and moved back when I was 15, it was exciting to grow up that way because if you were an American, every few months you had to leave the country to get your visa renewed. So the company would say, pick a country. And we'd go to a different country for a week. So a pastor friend of mine the other day had a list of like 100 cities and said the average number of cities that people have gone to on the list was like 15. And it was at, I think, 38 or 40 just because every 3 months we were going. When I was 11 years old, my parents let me fly home by myself for the first time. The trip, to explain, was Dubai, Amsterdam, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Halfway to Amsterdam, the plane crashed. I was on a 747 by myself, didn't know anybody else on the plane other than my French teacher. And there was a mechanical failure. The plane caught on fire. We ditched without wheels on a foamed runway in the middle of Austria. And God was totally in control. And after that, my parents said, you know what? You can go wherever you want, whenever you want. So I started being a world traveler very early.
Do you remember a lot of those experiences? Because 11, that's young to be traveling like that by yourself.
Yeah, I do. Our very first trip, my mom wanted to go to Cyprus because she was actually reading in the Book of Acts at the time. And going to Dubai, you had to carry your Bible with you or it wouldn't be there when you got there. So we all carried our Bibles with us. My mom was reading through Acts around the time, I guess it was November of the year we moved to Dubai, and they said, where do you want to go? And she's like, well, I want to go to Cyprus and see where Paul crash landed or crashed on the beach. And so that's our very first trip. I remember all of those trips very distinctly. I've been to Africa, a lot of Asia, lots of Europe, and then to places like Cyprus. When I was in ninth grade, actually our school only went up to ninth grade. And at the time, they would trot out a big map of the Eastern Hemisphere. You'd throw a dart, and wherever it landed, that was your class trip. So kids in America were going to the beach, and our dart landed in the Aegean. So we spent a week in Turkey and a week in Greece.
Wow. What an incredible experience growing up.
It was.
It sounds like your parents were people of faith. Mm-hmm. And so they processed it through that. How did you become a person of faith?
Yeah, so I've been in seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary, and my favorite professor one time told me that my story of coming to faith was even more boring than his wife's. He was an atheist and read John Stott and went down on a knee, not believing, and got up fully convicted and got out of his math tract and became a theologian. Yeah. I can't remember a time that I didn't know. There were certainly moments where I had a particular awareness that, yes, there really is a God. But my earliest memory really, I think, is of my grandmother. She had the Golden Book Bible, illustrated Bible, and she would read me stories at night before we moved to Dubai. And I vividly remember, in fact, I've got a copy of the book now, the illustrations of Daniel in the Lion's Den, which to this day is probably my favorite story in the Bible.
Yeah.
And we would come home during the summer, and I was always in church with her in the summer. There were really moments in my life, though, where like instead of having a moment of, yeah, God is real, I never really doubted. But there were moments in my life where he made it very, very clear to me that, yes, absolutely, this is me. In fact, my mom actually gets mad at the story because she has no memory of it. But till my dying breath, my sister and I will say it's true. We moved back from Dubai, and my mom's like, "You're 15. You need to get baptized." And I was not going to be pressured into getting baptized. And this came to a head one Sunday, and my mom says, "You got to get baptized this Sunday. I don't want to go to church if you're not going to get baptized. You're at the age you need to. You know this stuff. You just need to do it, not be spiteful." And she wouldn't go to church because my sister and I said, we're not going to do it. And the sermon that Sunday was on parents pressuring their children into getting baptized. And my sister and I looked at each other and made a beeline to the front of the church at the end of the service and said, it's time to do this.
Oh, my goodness. So you've had a really interesting career, and I know we'll get into some of this, but you went into law, you went to university, then you went into law. And at some point, you moved from being involved in law to being in politics. And I want you to tell us that story because I know the people who are watching this and listening to this are hearing every day, if your faith is not really a faith, you're only pro-life because you are a Republican or whatever. So that they're always being pushed into thinking that to believe that the Bible applies to anything is to be political. Okay, so tell us your story of how you got involved in politics.
Oh, so growing up in Dubai, we didn't really have a lot of American sports. We had camel racing and soccer, and politics.
Camel racing was a real thing, though.
Yeah, camel racing was a real thing. Listen, you'd actually have a piece of Velcro glued to your backside, and they would sit you down on the camel so you wouldn't fall off. I never did it. My parents were appalled at the idea of me doing it. I always wanted to, but in any event, so politics was a way to connect to the country. The school that I went to growing up, I can't begin to even describe it. I think the closest way for me to put it into context for what a type of school it was is that when I got to college, my freshman year in college, the biology textbook was the updated edition of the biology textbook I had in 8th grade. It was the school was very, very advanced, very deep, very good. And in my 8th grade year, it was the 1988 Bush-Dukakis election. The entire school from kindergarten through 9th grade was programmed around the American presidential election. And I fell in love with the idea of politics and moved back to Louisiana after 9th grade instead of going to boarding school. The Gulf War was breaking out and they were evacuating the American families. They were afraid Saddam Hussein would march down the coast into the UAE.
Okay.
And then got into Louisiana, which is a politics unlike anything on planet Earth. Went through the David Duke, Edwin Edwards election, the Klansman versus the Crook, where everyone in my family had the vote for the Crook, its important bumper sticker on their car, despite being Republicans. And I was just fascinated by it. I moved to Mercer University in Macon, Georgia for college, wanted to get out of Louisiana, started the College Republicans at Mercer, got involved in political campaigns, started working for a member of Congress, helped his campaign. He got elected in the 94 wave named Saxby Chambliss. And at some point, I remember him telling me that if I really wanted to go into politics, I should go to law school because law school is the MBA for politics. Go to Washington, it opens all the doors. So I went to law school. I really wanted to do election law, was able to kind of create a private internship with the Secretary of State to learn it. Wound up actually getting a job in Macon, married my wife. She didn't want to move to Washington or even Atlanta, so we stayed in Middle Georgia. And in my law firm, I really liked politics. I started writing about politics and then started having candidates who were running for office, and they needed someone who knew election law. And then they needed someone who knew how to run a campaign, and then they needed someone who knew how to make sure they weren't getting taken advantage of. And it slowly fell into it. And my law practice, by the time I left, I hated being a lawyer. There was this thing called a client, and they all had problems that were easy to solve, and they never wanted the solution.
Right.
And a friend of mine, redstate.com, had started, and I started running it. And one of the lawyers at the firm, one of the partners, came into my office one day. And he said, essentially, I won't use the language that he used, but that I was an idiot, that I loved politics. I didn't like law. I should go do that. And I basically left, took a job in Washington for a year to kind of build some connections, and then started writing full time as a blogger, still running political campaigns. And it was a lot more fun than practicing law, but the legal knowledge itself came in very handy to really think about the problems. And, even as a talk show host, I told someone the other day that the greatest career advice I could give someone going into wanting to be a talk show host is go to law school. Not because you learn the law, you learn how to think and research, and kind of gives you a broader context to be able to do it.
Tell us a little bit more about that. I know a lot of the young adults, a lot of our audience, people watching and listening, are in their 20s. They're trying to make career decisions right now. Make that case for law school real quick, just in case somebody's interested.
I don't know that I should. I tend to discourage people from doing it. There are too many lawyers in the world. But I will tell you this. I'm still paying on my law school loans, and I haven't practiced law since 2006.
Wow.
Probably, if you want to go to a public law school, not a private one like I did. But the one thing that was good about law school and the practice of law as well is it required you to learn a different way to think and argue. It required you to understand that people on the other side have a diametrically opposed view, but they're not the bad guy. They're just the guy who disagrees with you. And you shouldn't really take that personally. And then when I was a lawyer, frankly, I was required to do indigent criminal defense. I couldn't get out of it if I wanted to practice law. It was ruled unconstitutional a couple of years after I stopped practicing law. But while I was practicing law, I had to represent criminal defendants who couldn't afford a lawyer. And it was an eye-opening experience to me of a side of society that I had never encountered. A side of society where I really did see real racism, not the supposed racism we're all accused of these days, but actual racism. I saw a system where if you were poor and had to get a criminal defense attorney, you could wind up like someone like me, who didn't really like to do criminal law, but you're stuck with me and there's no way out of it. I also saw people who made terrible life choices, who blamed everyone else for their life choices. My last act as a lawyer actually was of a lady. I had been her indigent criminal defendant. She had stolen from her ex-husband. She was addicted to drugs, was prostituting herself, and she wound up going to jail for stealing from her ex-husband. And then she had liver failure and was absolutely going to die. And I had finished practicing law. I had moved to Washington, D.C. I was commuting back and forth because my wife didn't want to move up there. And she was dying, and my last job as a lawyer was to convince the judge to let her out of jail so she could go home to die instead of being in prison. And that was my last case. And she died on Christmas Eve in, I think, 2006. And it showed me a part of society I didn't really ever grow up around or relate to, and humanized a lot of stories. My very first case as a lawyer was an illegal alien who lived in the States, had saved up his money, had built a life here with his family, worked as a migrant farmer, went to a mobile home manufacturer and paid cash for a brand new mobile home with brand new appliances. And when he got it, it was a used trailer and a lot of the appliances were broken. And when he showed up at the place, the manager of the facility, it's a nationwide chain, told him there's nothing you can do about it. I know you're an illegal alien. You're nothing but an effing and slur for an Hispanic person. And I honestly, I didn't believe him, to be really frank with you, but I was great at writing letters. If there's one thing I could do as a lawyer was write a nasty letter. And I did. Right out of law school, had just passed the bar, fired off the nasty letter. A week later, the lawyer calls and offers $50,000 on a brand new trailer. And I had so I tell the woman, I said, ma'am, I got to ask you, just lawyer to lawyer, I'm brand new out of law school. What on earth did I do that made you do this? And she said, well, I didn't believe you, but I called the manager of the store and I asked him the case. He says, oh, yes, I remember that effing so-and-so. And she said, he no longer works for us. We'd like to make your client whole. So,
wow.
I mean, I've got great stories to tell, but I've also seen that side of the world that a lot of people don't necessarily see. So when people tell me there's racism, I've seen it. When people tell me there's systemic racism, I've seen a society that bends over backwards to help keep people out of prison.
And a lot of what you're talking about, the world experiences that you've had, the experiences working with people who most of us wouldn't encounter in any given day, all of that has made you a very different kind of talk show host. I mean, if someone listens to your show, they're going to be surprised, I think, on a couple of things. First of all, the empathy that you have for people who see things differently than you. And I think, second of all, they'll see that you're not always coming down on with a predictable, this is the conservative line, whatever the talking points are. So I want to get into radio a little bit, and you got into it in a funny way. On your website, you say that you got started in radio when the local radio host got arrested in a crack house.
Yes, true story.
And so they said, "Well, we can't possibly do any worse. We might as well have Erick." Is that how that?
Pretty much, yeah. So I had left my law firm, was running redstate.com. And then, this is just a very short tangential story. One of those moments in life where God really put his finger down and said, I'm here. In 2006, I was out of my law firm running Red State. My wife and I had gone to the beach. We'd had our first child. She was a year old. My wife got really sick. It wound up being her gallbladder, but they found something odd in her lungs. So the week before Christmas 2006, my wife had to go into the hospital, and they gave her 6 months to live. They said she had a very rare form of cancer. It had spread to her lungs, and wow. It was raining. The doctors had to go to the emergency room, so I got to be the one to hold my wife's hand and tell her she was going to die. And then, oh, by the way, I got to go get our kid out of daycare. Wow. She's going to be home in a little while. And thankfully, it was a misdiagnosis. 24 hours later, they came in and they said, hey, we've never actually seen this before. I say that, and then 10 years later, they had to send it off to the Mayo Clinic that they diagnosed it. 10 years later, the Mayo Clinic reached out and said, hey, remember that from 10 years ago? We're seeing a lot of people get cancer who had that. You need to come check. Had they not misdiagnosed her in 2006, she would have never known in 2016 she had lung cancer. But that kind of put us on a road where I knew I needed to step up more. And she was working for a university. So fast forward a couple of years, we have our second child, and she's like, I want to spend time with the kids. I want to be a stay-at-home mom. So I knew I was going to get a second job. And we really prayed about it and made the decision she was going to quit her job. I actually got the application to work at Dillard's and sell suits. 24 hours later, a lady calls me from CNN who I had unknowingly encountered years before. And she says, hey, we'd like to offer you a job at CNN, making way more money than I ever made in my lifetime, well more than my wife's income. And so she was able to stay home with the kids. I was able to do CNN and Red State. So a year later falls, and I'm in Macon, Georgia. The local talk show host who does 6 to 9 in the morning gets arrested in a crack house. He's new to town, had some issues, gets arrested. And so they call me and say, hey, you're on CNN. Have you ever done radio? I said, no. And they said, would you like to? I said, sure. So I go in, fill in for this guy for a day. It becomes a week. It becomes 3 months. I get paid in an expired gift certificate to Outback Steakhouse. But along the way, the head of Cox Media Group, the president, is driving through Macon on his way to Disney World and hears it, thinks I'm actually the guy, and knows Herman Cain is going to run for president. So they offer me Herman Cain's job, and been on radio for a decade now, never having intended to do it.
Wow. Amazing story. And you're on 3 hours a day, right? With your
so show. I was doing 2 shows for a while. I was doing 5 hours for up until June 1st, and now I just do noon to 3 on so WSB in Atlanta is the largest talk station in the country, and I was doing evening drive time, and now after Rush passed, they put me into his spot. Yeah.
I have so many questions about this, but I guess my overarching question, if any of us who are watching and listening to this right now were to sit down behind that microphone for 3 hours, I would have brain freeze. I mean, How do you fill 3 hours of time every single day? How do you prepare for that? How do you roll with it? What are some of the things that have happened that are memorable for you?
This one's actually hard to answer. I don't tend to talk on the phone. I don't talk a lot. And then for those 3 hours, it's my universe. And it's me in the room where I am with the microphone I'm talking on here. And it's just whatever I want to talk about, whatever I'm interested in. I try to focus on the big stories of the day. What a lot of conservative radio does that I think is it's fine, but it's not me, is just I'm going to tell you what I think. I think we kind of live in a postmodern age where everybody has their individual truth. And I always say on radio, if Jesus is the truth, then there's got to be an objective truth. There's got to be a real truth, not mine or yours. And so I try to spend my time every day saying, okay, side A says this, side B says this, side C says this. What actually is happening, either based on what they're saying or picking up the phone and talking to people myself, and start my show with, here's the big story of the day. This is the truth. This is the actual truth. Now let me tell you what I think about it now that you know the truth. And I try to do that with all the topics. My routine is typically I get up early in the morning, go through all the different news outlets. I do my own show prep. I don't have a team helping me. And I kind of prioritize, this is the story I want to talk about the most, and then outline an hour around that theme. And then I want to talk about this story, and it's big, and do an hour of this, and then a third hour. It never actually works out that way. Like today, I was going to start with the Kevin DeYoung and the reparations story that's sweeping through evangelical movements overnight after a rebuttal to him. And instead, I started with Jeff Bezos and the rocket. I think I've got 5 or 6 stories I never even got to, because as I was working today live in the show, I'm getting breaking news updates about other things, and I'm trying to pivot. And while I'm on the show, I have 2 guys who help me. And as there's breaking news, they're feeding me information. So being able to adapt it. It's one thing law school helped me with, is being able to pivot on the dime to be able to go off in a different direction. But I will tell you this, and this is the thing, it genuinely fascinates me. Rush Limbaugh and I have talked about this before, and he was the exact same way. The moment I am done talking, I can't tell you what I talked about. I can't tell you what I said. It is out into the ether, and I don't retain it.
Well, it's formed out, though, somehow through your worldview. I mean,
yeah.
When you read these news stories and you try to figure out what your approach is going to be, you have some sense of what the core principles are, or the core worldview. How do you strengthen that?
So, I over time, and one of the things that I appreciated about going to seminary is when I started, there really aren't a lot of people in either TV news, whether you're on Fox or Newsmax or OAN or CNN, or definitely not even in talk radio, who really explicitly blend a Christian worldview with the news of the day. Now, there are Christian talk show hosts on Christian radio stations who do that.
Right.
But in like a national station like a WSB, the largest talk station in the country, there's not anybody who explicitly says, I'm a Christian. I see the world through the framework of eternity, a heaven and a hell, good and evil. And this is how I see every story. And when I get up in the morning, that intuitively, foundationally is my worldview. There's a God, and there are people opposed to God, and the world hates the things of God. And so much of what we see, particularly on the cultural front, is the world rebelling against God. And even within the conservative movement, where I've long been a part, we're seeing a paganism creep into a conservative movement, where you're seeing people who are culturally Christian, but they're not really Christian, now trying to normalize things that I as a Christian can't. Or the way they want to fight issues is, I'm going to behave just like the left. And my view is, I'm a Christian. My ways can't be their ways. If I'm behaving like someone who doesn't believe in God, I got a problem. I'm going to cost someone their soul. Even now, I'm a Calvinist. I'm the once saved, always saved. But I'm mindful that I've got to be a witness. Being in seminary has helped me really think about that a lot. The Christian doctrine of vocation, and really one of the greatest speeches ever given on the topic, without using the word doctrine of vocation, I think, is Martin Luther King Jr.'s street sweeper speech. That if you're a street sweeper, be the absolute best street sweeper you can be. It glorifies God. And I feel like when I sit behind the microphone, I got to glorify God. That sometimes puts me at odds with my audience. They get really mad at me. when I tell them what I genuinely know to be true, but everyone around them tells them otherwise. And I can share with them through the lens of my worldview, and they know whether they agree with me or not. My heart's in the right place, so they're not going to pack up and leave me. Like, for example, in 2016, I didn't support Donald Trump in 2016 and was very clear with my audience why. I'm a Christian. I think character counts. I don't like any of these candidates. I can't do it. And they were very, very angry with me. We actually had people show up at our house and threaten us. My kids were chased through a store, being yelled at by a man who said their dad was going to destroy the country. They were in a Christian school getting bullied by kids whose parents were telling them I was the enemy for destroying the country. And I stuck to my convictions, and the audience, they disagreed with me, but they didn't leave me because they knew where my heart was. And I think coming into every day saying, this really is my worldview, and there's a loud voice on my side of the conservative movement now saying, do exactly what the other side is doing because that's how they win. And I got to be the guy who says, no, that's not me. I'm a Christian before I'm a conservative. I can't do that.
Do candidates, because of your position, I know they want to be on, they want to talk to you, they want to reach your audience, but do they ever come to you, candidates for office, and ask for advice or try to get your insight?
A lot. More in the past few years. In fact, I've gotten a number of candidates who are thinking about 2024 for president who reached out. I've got to be friends with some of them. It was kind of interesting in 2016. Almost every single one of them I knew personally, and several of them were friends. And so in the run up to even 2024 or in the Trump White House, a lot of the people who work for him were longtime friends of mine. And they do. And I try to, if I have a terrible character flaw that a lot of people wouldn't see as one, it's definitely being a people pleaser. I try to say yes to people. I try to be agreeable. I try not to be a jerk. And sometimes that puts me into obligations where I wish I could say no, but it's just not my nature to tell people no. But trying to navigate this and say, listen, I like you. You're a friend of mine, but this person is also a friend and I'm not going to pick sides, but I'm happy to freely give you advice. I will. And oftentimes lately, it's not just because I live in Georgia and it's a swing state and they want advice about that, but also it's how do I see bridging the divides among Republicans and conservatives these days, where you have a lot of people who are purportedly on the same side, but they increasingly hate each other's guts.
I saw just on Sunday an article, and quoted in the article was David Shore, who was a campaign advisor for Barack Obama, saying that in his view, white people who are far left are trying to control the Democratic Party and driving away other people, including Middle Americans, Hispanics, blacks, and so forth. And Georgia seems to be in some ways an epicenter of that battle right now. And I'm curious what you're telling these candidates. How do they navigate that? Because I have to know that because I'm having lunch and on airplanes with people and all different viewpoints.
Yeah. Well, so my buddy Patrick Ruffini runs a group called Echelon Insights. They do a lot of polling, and I actually talked about this on radio today. 75% of white college-educated Democrats agree with the statement that the United States is systemically racist in its policies and in the implementation of its policies. Wow. 54% of black Democrats agree. So 75% of white college Democrats say it. 54% of black Democrats say it. Less than 45% of blacks overall say it. Yeah, which is fascinating. In the same way, something like 50% of black Democrats say with hard work you can get ahead of this country. Only 33% of white college-educated Democrats believe that. There is this divide in the Democratic Party, and I've frankly been telling Republicans that one thing you've got to do, particularly with Hispanic voters, is stop treating them like they're an identity group. I know I have a lot of friends of mine who would be labeled as Hispanic, but they're actually Argentinian, Brazilian, Venezuelan, Guatemalan, Honduran, Cuban. Stop treating them as an identity block, and they want to be Americans. Treat them as Americans. Don't patronize them. Don't get the guys. I ridicule the Republicans in Georgia all the time for hiring the people who go out and say "Hola" and try to do their bad Spanish impression. Just talk to them as moms, as doctors, as farmers, as migrant workers. And to the extent they get that, their message is resonating, the American message that you can get ahead. Unfortunately, I think there is part of the Republican Party that demographically has said, these are our jobs. We need to be protectionists. We need to close the border. I actually think Hispanic voters want to secure the border because they came here legally. They don't want others to jump the line. They didn't jump the line. But then when you get here, what do you do? And there's a real divide among Republicans. And I think the path forward, frankly, is let's build a great big giant wall and secure the border. But then if you get in, we love you and give you a job and love your neighbor. We shouldn't be otherizing them. To the extent the Democratic Party continues to play identity politics, I think it helps the Republicans. And I try to tell Republican candidates that. But I also try to tell them, like I tell my audience, we really are in a time of political realignment in the country. Mm-hmm. Friends of mine who I believe were conservative, small government conservatives, I see now advocating unions, private sector unions. Mm-hmm. Democratic friends of mine who were always on the left are now so upset about the wokeism, they're becoming Republicans. And so I just think you got to offer way more grace to everyone right now, that you've got to be willing to tell people, I'm going to be your friend, even if we come to different conclusions, because these are none of us have been in these charted waters before. They're uncharted. So let's just show grace to each other and agree neither of us is here to destroy the country. There certainly are some, but most of us, we just arrive at different conclusions on what's best for the country.
When I'm hearing you say that, Eric, I hear echoes of Ronald Reagan. He always managed to find a way to communicate to everybody and in a cool, calm, collected way, share his convictions. But it was hard to be mad at him. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering where we lost that common sense approach to politics, and how do we get it back?
Oh, well, I mean, I can give you the one monologue that I know I give because I say it all the time, to the extent that my producer sometimes says it. I do it too much. Let me set the stage for you, though. So in 2016, I was a rabid Republican partisan and always told people, vote for the most conservative person in the primary and the Republican in the general. And we got to 2016, and I knew Donald Trump, was not a fan of his, didn't like Hillary Clinton, and just said, I can't do it. And we had people show up. 5-6 feet from where these people showed up outside my front door to yell at me and threaten my family and cost me my job. And we had people chase my kids through a store. Yeah, they were bullied at school. My son was beat up at school because of my politics by people who were Christians, went to church, but thought I was destroying the world. And then through all of this, I was just having trouble breathing. Thought it was allergies, and it just kept getting worse until my wife made me go to the doctor. They sent me to the ER. They gave me a CT scan, and next thing I know, I'm being wheeled into an ICU, and they're calling my family saying I'm not going to make it through the night. I had so many blood clots in my lungs to this day. When a doctor sees my scans, he wants to know how I'm still alive. I was there for 2 weeks, and I had to completely unplug. And in that time in the hospital by myself, no computer, my wife wouldn't let me bring my computer in. And, I realized I had been part of this movement of firing people up, telling them every election was the end of the world if they didn't get it right. And realizing that's not really the case, and realizing, I very really would have died. And the punchline to all of that is the day, literally as they're wheeling me in to the ICU is the exact same moment they're calling my wife from the Mayo Clinic to tell her she has a genetic incurable form of lung cancer. All within a period of 20 minutes, all of that happens.
Oh my goodness.
And I got to realize there's more to life than politics.
Yeah.
And to the extent that I can be a part of something and remind people that there's hope, there's grace, there's God, there's not just politics, I should. And in that roundabout way, I came to the conclusion that I've got to remind people that Washington is not going to solve all of our problems. And if I can go on radio and preach regularly, it's Jeremiah 29:7, seek the welfare of the city in which you live and pray for it, and there you'll find your welfare. And that we're passing through to eternity, and along the way, our job isn't to improve Washington. Me in Georgia, my job's not to improve Georgia. It's to improve Macon, Georgia. And if I improve Macon, Georgia, then Macon, Georgia as an improved place is going to improve Georgia, and Georgia as an improved place is going to improve Washington. But I got to be mindful to people who we all get so whipped up in what's happening in Washington. You're more likely to be affected by your school board or in your city council than by what happens in Congress or the White House. And we just need to change perspectives. The anger can build when we all focus collectively in one place that in the grand scheme of things doesn't really affect a whole lot of our lives.
What is that relationship between the bigger you think the problem is, the more helpless you feel, the more worried about it you are, the angrier you become? Does that kind of describe where we are?
I think so. People look at Washington as abstract. Both parties as not listening. Trump supporters very much like the president because they felt like they had been voting Republican a lot. The Republicans had betrayed them and ignored them. So might as well burn it all down and start over with a guy who would keep his promises. And he did. And he was an agent of chaos, and people liked him for it because he really bullied a lot of people who deserve dirt. I mean, from the voter perspective, deserve being bullied for betraying them for so long. But also not a lot changed in the same way that, Obamacare changed healthcare, but really in the grand scheme of things, it didn't change a ton. His administration didn't, Bush's administration didn't, Trump's administration didn't, but it seems so abstract and vague and mysterious, and people blame it for everything. Your state and local politicians love to blame Washington to escape responsibility for local decisions. And really, I mean, we got a homeless man down the street that needs to be taken care of. Washington's not going to feed him, but your church might, your city might have a solution. And just trying to get people to remember, you really, God's in control. You may be angry and scared at the situation, and you may want to vote for a politician who you think is going to smite to the other side for you. But why do you need a politician when you got the God of all creation on your side?
A lot of my Catholic friends talk about the idea of subsidiarity, that you are, the best solution to a problem is the one that's closest to the problem itself.
I tell people all the time I'm a conservative because I'm a Christian, and I know we're all sinners and want as few in charge of me as possible.
Now, when you think about that, though, it does seem like the news cycle. And I think most people now, especially in the age of COVID and handouts and all these different things, people have started to believe once again that everything that can be solved out of Washington.
I think Washington has solved just about all Washington can solve. We've abdicated our personal responsibility. We see this in the church. Churches abdicate to government to take care of the homeless person. You've got the progressive churches have grabbed hold of social justice to try to bring heaven to earth. Conservative evangelical churches say, we're here to feed the soul, not the hungry person, but the hungry person needs his stomach calmed down so he can actually hear the gospel. We abdicate so much to Washington, D.C. All of us do. Local government does. We do. We get mad at Washington about our school funding. We get mad at Washington about our roads, our taxes, and so much of it is actually the local government and property taxes, the state government and the highway department. And the sooner we realize that we can solve problems locally and re-empower local government and local nonprofits to do it, I think the better off we'll be. There's a strain of conservatism right now that wants to use the power of Washington to impose conservatism across the country. If you're to use the power of Washington to impose conservatism across the country, you need to use that power to break up Washington and restore power to local communities and states where people can agree to disagree, and we can have federalism, and California can have its way of life, and Georgia and Texas can have their way of life, and everyone's got to get along.
Take us through some action steps, Eric, because I know you're dealing with the local situation in Georgia. You talked about Macon, Georgia specifically. People who are watching and listening right now, and there are thousands of people who download this show. So this could actually happen. Give us some practical steps to go local. What should we be doing, say, in the next month?
First of all, I would ask people, and I talk about this on radio, do you know where your local battered women's shelter is? Because every community has them, and they're not well known because they don't want the batterers to show up. But do you know? Do you know how to get involved? Do you know where your local food bank is? Do you know the needs of your local soup kitchen? Find out those and help them. Then, have you ever been to your Board of Education meeting? Have you ever been to your city council meeting? Do you know who your city councilman is or your county commissioner? Have you ever called them just to introduce yourself as a constituent? Get known in your community. And then I like to challenge churches. It's great. Go to pick your foreign country with a nice beach and send your kids there to build houses. But have you done that in your backyard? Have you sought the welfare of your community by rallying the kids of your church to not just go to some far off country on a mission trip, but actually to go into your city on a mission trip?
Yeah.
To share the gospel by sharing love, by building a house, to love your neighbor locally, not in the abstract, but in the real. I think if you involve yourself in the community, you're seen in the community, it's hard to demonize a local conservative Christian church or person when they're in the community loving their neighbor.
Apply that to young adults. I know a lot of 20-somethings are listening right now, watching the show. And a lot of them tell me that they feel completely overwhelmed. It's driving them toward apathy, maybe even to anxiety for a lot of them. Could you just speak to them for a minute, give them a word of encouragement from a guy who's a little further down the road?
So I've got a 15-year-old daughter who is very much into pop culture and Taylor Swift. And I, to some degree, I worry about that because of the way culture is going. But, my preacher said something I thought was rather profound a while back, that the opposite, we all say the opposite of love is hate. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And people, particularly young Christians, overwhelmed by culture, the culture is not training them to hate the culture is training them to be indifferent to the culture.
Yeah.
And if they're indifferent to the culture, they can't provide an alternative to the culture. They can't be the salt and light in the world when they're indifferent to the culture around them, when they look like the culture around them, when they're as angry as the culture around them, as confused as the culture around them. If you believe there's a God in creation, the first words of the Bible, in the beginning, God created. The Hebrew word is bara. It's a divine word. Only God can create in that way. The people who built Babel could not create in that way. Only God can. And God created the heavens and the earth and you and me and everything around us. That means he's in charge and he's sovereign and he's with you if you're with him. And so the world tries to overwhelm you. So several things you can do is, one, have yourself a close-knit group of friends who are believers. They don't have to go to the same church. They don't have to be of the same denomination or read the same version of the Bible, but have them with shared values. They can be your source of strength. And then be a part of the world where you can go into culture, not hide from culture, where you can volunteer either with a church group or with a local pro-life group or with a local homeless shelter, where you're actually showing yourself in the world, helping other people. And don't be afraid to stand up for your values. And that's the hardest part of it. The world wants you to either be indifferent or to be too scared to speak up. So find a place where you can involve yourself, show your love for the community. So when the time comes, when the world comes to you and demands that you change your worldview, those around you know your heart. They know you and they know Christ by you reflecting him in the community. That's again, it's hate. It's so easy to hate. But really, it's the indifference. The world would very much prefer you to be indifferent to the culture around it because it's way easier for the culture to run over you when you're indifferent to it.
Wow. I'm not going to forget that. I'm not soon going to forget this. That the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. You've given us so many things to think about, Erick, and thank you for your vulnerability, sharing about your personal life and the struggles that you've gone through. It really helps me as I'm getting to know your work to sense the heart for God that you have and everything that you do. So thanks for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Erick Erickson, for joining us on the Dr. Jeff Show today. You can follow Erick Erickson on Twitter at EW Erickson. And Erickson is spelled Erickson. You can also see his website at erickericksonshow.com. The show is on 12 to 3 Eastern Time. I encourage you to check it out. Remember, worldview changes everything. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Dr. Jeff Show. It's a podcast from Summit Ministries, summit.org. Summit is a nonprofit ministry that exists to equip and support the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. For nearly 60 years, Summit Ministries has been training students and those who work with students to develop, deepen, and defend a biblical worldview through life-changing conferences, thoughtful church, homeschool and Christian school curriculum books, free online resources, and more. If you want to live out a biblical worldview in today's world, and you desire to instill a lifelong faith in the rising generation, visit summit.org/The Dr. Jeff Show for more information.